There, so now I think I'm recording. So our big idea, our last big idea is cellular respiration. Okay? We've been talking about photosynthesis and kind of the different processes involved in that. We've been talking about biochemical reactions. Now we're going to talk about cellular respiration. Moving to next step. All right. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O and energy. Does this reaction formula look somewhat familiar?
It's the opposite of photosynthesis.
Kind of, sort of, maybe, right? Like, hey, we've seen all of these parts before, but yeah, it's that photosynthesis in reverse. And in fact, the way that we're talking about it, we talked about photosynthesis first. Now we're talking about cellular respiration. Depending on what textbook or what teacher you listen to, they might flip-flop those things around. Okay, we could talk about cellular respiration first, then talk about photosynthesis. Okay, they're the same ingredients, if you will, kind of from a science, chemistry standpoint. The thing that's changing are if it's a reactant or if it's a product. Okay. There are some excellent resources out there about cellular respiration. We're not going to go through all three of these, but I do want to show you where some of those resources are. And then we are actually going to watch one of these in class. I think I've settled on watching the Bozeman Science one this year, but there are a couple other great ones. The ATP in respiration from Crash Course is another excellent one. Paul Anderson does a great job. He's a nationally acclaimed high school biology teacher, so this is his thing. Crash Course tends to be aimed at high school level and then also a little bit into the introductory college level. So some of the stuff is a little nerdier than we have to get into for high school, but they do it in a very, Hank Green goes through that, I think, in a pretty neat way. I appreciate his quirky sense of humor anyways. And then the final video resource that you have, Sal Khan from Khan Academy. You've probably heard of Khan Academy before. He has a number of videos and actually numerous videos talking about glycolysis and cellular respiration. He gets into some real nerdy details on that. Some of his other videos on this topic, again, they're great resources, but they go into more detail than what we really need. But I would recommend watching the Intro to Cellular Respiration. All right. When we're talking about cellular respiration and photosynthesis and ATP included, one of my challenges is trying to strike that balance between giving you enough science, right, raising it above that middle school level, at the same time not drowning us in too much chemistry or nerdiness, if you will. So I'm going to try and keep it basic, but I do want to talk about some of the details involved. Cellular respiration can be thought of in kind of three parts: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. There's also another little side pathway, a little side journey that we're going to talk about, which is fermentation. So, yeah, we could also sneak in here fermentation. All right. First, I do want to review a little bit about ATP. We talked about ATP with photosynthesis. ATP is also is kind of nicknamed the currency of energy a cell can use, right? If you go to Canada, they have dollars and quarters and things of that sort, but it's not the same currency that we have here in the United States, even though they use the same names for their money. Okay, you go to Mexico, you have a different currency. You go to Russia or France or someplace in Europe, and they've got their own currency. Okay, it's all money. Okay, but you have to exchange it depending on what country you're in. Okay, it's in a form that's usable. Okay, so we've been talking about carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and all of these things and how they're used. Some of those things are used for energy, but we have to translate it into something that cells can use. And that energy form that a cell can use is the ATP, okay, or the currency of ATP. And the way that we use ATP as energy, or for energy, is this last phosphate group right there. Remember that when you're breaking and building bonds, energy is involved. Okay? When that third phosphate group is broken off, energy is released. A lot of energy. What's that? Yes, excellent question. So after you pop off that one phosphate group, it is converted, or it's now ADP, because there's two phosphate groups instead of three phosphate groups. Okay. By the way, these shapes here for that ATP molecule, those are kind of the general outline of the way that they're laid out, but understand that it actually is more complicated than that. Like this phosphate group has some oxygens off from it and some other things. I don't care about getting into all of those details. So we're just going to kind of use these generic shapes. All right, so now we're going to talk about glycolysis. Okay, this is in glycolysis, it's going to break down that currency of ATP. So when you break that down and pop off that phosphate group, you're going to have heat that is released. Okay, so some of the energy is going to be from heat. Okay. When you go through the complete cellular respiration kind of process in ideal conditions, you can generate 38 of those ATP molecules. And again, the ATP is really what we're getting at, okay, where you take those complex foods, break them down into simpler molecules, and then further break them down into things like ATP that a cell can actually use. Okay? A cell cannot use cheeseburger. Okay? It has to break it down into simpler parts. And ATP is what we're looking for. So yeah, let's do a little vocab builder here. First one is a little bit of review. Os. There's our old friend os. What does os equal or kind of translate to? Sugar. Okay, and I don't think we talked about the first half of glucose, which is the glyc in glycolysis, or the glucose. What that means, I should have left myself a little more space here, is sweet. Okay, so when you have the word glucose, it actually translates to sweet sugar. My S's aren't coming up very well. Sweet sugar. Now, for most of us, when we think of sugar, we think that sugar is sweet, but in chemistry, not all sugars are sweet. So, not redundant to say sweet sugar. So, if we know we have sweet and we have sugar for glucose, then we have this other kind of related word, glycolysis. So we know that glyc is going to be our sweet, not sweat. Sweet, what's the lysis then? I don't expect you to know this one, but just curious if anyone happens to know. Sour? No, good guess, but it's not the opposite of sweet or the opposite of sugar. Lysis means to split or break apart. So glycolysis literally means splitting the sweetness, or kind of splitting or breaking up the sweet stuff. Okay. We're going to be talking about glycolysis. We're also going to talk about fermentation, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. In all of those, we're going to look at where is it located, how is oxygen involved, or in some cases not involved, and what are the products or end results. Okay? With glycolysis, the first part, remember these are all parts of cellular respiration, this is going to take place in the cytoplasm. Okay, that's going to take place in the cytoplasm of that cell. Okay, and I'm going to just draw a little arrow down here. Oxygen is not required for the first part, glycolysis. First part of cellular respiration. Oxygen is not required. If it's present, though, it won't stop it from happening. So if there's oxygen, okay, that's great. If there's not, that's okay too. Okay, so it's not required, but it doesn't interfere. What's going to happen with the splitting the sweetness or breaking up the sweetness is the 6-carbon backbone ring, okay, the carbon ring that we have, it's called the backbone ring, is going to be broken into 2 parts, okay, and it's going to make or break that into 2 pyruvates. 2 pyruvates. So when glycolysis is done, it actually needs energy to run glycolysis, okay? It needs 2 ATP to run, and it generates 4 ATP, okay? So it produces 4, but it takes 2 to get it started. So what's our net result of ATP? Hopefully you don't have to be a math wizard here. It needs 2 to make 4. So it's only going to actually create 2 ATP when it's all said and done. Okay, you're also going to be left with these pyruvate molecules and 10 NAD pluses. Okay, we're going to talk about NAD pluses a little later down the road when we get to the electron transport chain, and that's even though our ultimate goal here is to make the ATPs, the NAD pluses are what's really what's going to help us make the ATP down the road. So at first this doesn't seem like a very efficient system. You have to spend 2 to get 4, so you're only getting 2 out of the deal. You still come out ahead, but not as much as you'd like. After glycolysis, there are kind of 2 pathways, and this depends on the organism and also depends on the conditions. You can end up taking an aerobic pathway or an anaerobic pathway. I think this would be a good time to review aerobic. What makes something aerobic?
Doesn't it require oxygen?
O2 is required, right? And anaerobic? No O2. Okay. I'm glad you'd said that. It said CO2. You might think that it's going to be think of CO2 as being its opposite, but it's really not. Anaerobic just means that there's no O2 around. Okay. So if it's anaerobic, this is going to be a process that doesn't need oxygen to run. And that is going to take us into our next one, which is fermentation.